You're about to hear the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before bed. In a quiet stretch of rural Missouri, far from the hum of cities and cameras, a woman vanished without a sound. No forced entry. No frantic 911 call. Just gone. And weeks later, when investigators opened a freezer behind an old house on Moon Valley Road, they found flesh wrapped in plastic, labeled with the date she died. Her name was Cassidy Rainwater. She was 33. When I first heard her story, it didn't seem all that unusual. People disappear, especially in rural places like the Ozarks, where privacy is a way of life and no one asks too many questions. At first glance, this was just another missing persons case. Tragic, but not rare. But what happened to Cassidy, what was done to her, that's what shook me. Because behind her disappearance was something far darker, something primal, calculated, almost ritualistic. And the further I went down this road, the more I realized this wasn't just about a woman who vanished. It was about two men who turned horror into routine, in a system that didn't notice until it was far too late. Cassidy had been trying to get her life back on track. That summer of 2021, she was staying at a house in the woods outside Lebanon, Missouri, a house owned by a man named James Phelps. He wasn't a friend, not exactly, more of a contact. Someone who'd offered her a place to stay while she figured things out. Cassidy's life had been complicated. She'd struggled with housing, bounced between friends, and was trying to find stability. Her family wasn't alarmed when she didn't check in for a few days. Neither were police. After all, she was an adult, free to come and go. But the silence stretched into weeks. It wasn't until late August that a friend finally filed a missing persons report. Even then, the urgency wasn't high. The Ozarks have seen their share of people living off-grid, going dark for a while. That's part of life in places like this. If you don't want to be found, most folks won't look too hard. But someone was watching. On September 16th, the FBI's Kansas City office received an anonymous tip. No note, no explanation, just a folder of digital photographs. And what they saw changed everything. Cassidy was in a cage. Stripped, wounded, alive. The images weren't blurry or vague. They were deliberate, documented, almost staged, as if someone wanted the world to see, or maybe just wanted to relive it. That's when the real investigation began, and it's where I joined the story. When I drove out to Moon Valley Road for the first time, I remember the way the road just ended, like the pavement itself didn't want to keep going. No cell service, no traffic, just dense woods and silence. The house was barely visible from the tree line, and if you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd drive right past it. But someone had known exactly what they were looking for, and they'd found much more than just Cassidy Rainwater. The photos landed like a thunderclap. No one at the FBI office that day expected to be pulled into one of the most disturbing homicide cases Missouri had seen in decades. There were 7 images in total. All of them showed Cassidy Rainwater in some form of distress, partially nude, bruised, caged. Not metaphorically, literally. A steel-barred cage. Inside a dim room. Her eyes swollen, her expression vacant. The kind of photos that don't just suggest a crime, they scream it. Within hours, the images were traced back to a device associated with one man, James Phelps, the property owner where Cassidy had last been seen. The same man who'd once offered her a place to get back on her feet. Now, suddenly, he was the center of a federal investigation. On September 16, 2021, law enforcement descended on Phelps's house at Moon Valley Road. It wasn't easy to get there. The place sat in the middle of nowhere, nestled in the woods, beyond the reach of casual visitors or even curious neighbors. A deliberate choice, I'd learn later. Agents made contact and quickly secured the property. Phelps was inside, calm, cooperative, even helpful. He claimed Cassidy had stayed there briefly but left weeks ago and hadn't been heard from since. But the search warrant told a different story. Inside Phelps's phone, investigators found the same 7 photos the FBI had received. Metadata placed the images at that very location. They'd been taken on or around late July, the exact window when Cassidy had gone missing. More chillingly, some of the images had been edited, cropped, adjusted, as if someone had been curating them. That wasn't all. The house itself was eerie, sparse, functional, a sense of clinical detachment. No warmth, no personality. In the back room, law enforcement discovered a metal cage, large enough for a human to sit or lie down in. It matched the one from the photos. Nearby, They found restraints, plastic sheeting, and what looked like blood traces on the floor. It was quickly becoming clear. Cassidy hadn't just passed through this house. She'd suffered here. Still, something didn't add up. The crime scene didn't feel like the work of just one man. That's when Timothy Norton entered the picture. Norton was a long-haul trucker with a criminal past, known associate of Phelps, and, as it turned out, a frequent visitor to the Moon Valley property. His name popped up in message logs and location data tied to the house. When police brought him in for questioning, he denied everything. At first, but under pressure, and faced with mounting evidence, Norton cracked. He told investigators that he and Phelps had been planning Cassidy's murder for weeks. That on the night of July 24th, he held her down as Phelps suffocated her using a plastic bag over her head. He gave every gruesome detail, including what they did with her body afterward. The calmness in his voice, that's what stuck with the officers. No rage, no guilt, just process. They'd used a gantry crane, the kind typically used to skin deer, to hoist Cassidy's body. Phelps then disemboweled and dismembered her. That's when I realized we were no longer dealing with a simple murder. This was premeditated, systematic. There was a routine here, a ritual, even. And I had to ask, was Cassidy there first? When the search team returned to the property with cadaver dogs and forensic experts, they focused on two areas: the freezer inside the house and the wooded land just behind it. What they found was worse than anyone expected. The first thing they noticed in the freezer was the labeling. Not meat, not vegetables, not anything you'd expect to find in a rural Missouri home. Just a Ziploc bag, half frozen, wrapped in duct tape, with a crude black marker scrawled across it, 7/24. The date Cassidy Rainwater died. Inside were human remains, flesh and tissue, processed and packed like wild game. Investigators recovered several such bags. It wasn't just the content that chilled them. It was the intention, the deliberateness. Someone had not only killed Cassidy, they'd preserved her. They didn't stop there. Behind the house, scattered across the tree line and underbrush, were bone fragments. Dozens. Some cracked, some burned, some cleanly cut. It took weeks of forensic testing, but one by one, the results came back. All of them were Cassidy's. Some pieces had been moved, suggesting disposal in stages. Some showed signs of post-mortem manipulation. This wasn't a panic cover-up. It was methodical. I spoke with one of the local deputies off record. He'd been first on scene during the property search. It felt like a scene out of Silence of the Lambs, he told me. Only worse. Because it was real. You walk into that place, and it just feels wrong. Like the house itself was hiding something. At the center of it all was James Phelps, the soft-spoken older man who had offered Cassidy shelter. His neighbors knew little about him. Just a quiet guy who kept to himself. Some thought he was eccentric. Others figured he was just another recluse living in the Ozarks. No one suspected this. His partner, Timothy Norton, had already confessed. But even in his confession, there were gaps. He claimed Phelps had done most of it, that he was just helping, that he'd only held her down, nothing more. But the facts said otherwise. Photos recovered from both men's phones showed Cassidy not just in captivity, but in different stages, clothed, unclothed, wounded. There was video, too, though the details of that footage have never been made public. What investigators did confirm was this: Cassidy had been alive in that cage for days before she was killed. That part haunted me, because until that moment, I thought this story was about a brutal murder. But it wasn't just murder. It was torture. It was control. It was cruelty layered over time. Both men were charged. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. Abandonment of a corpse. The list was long, and getting longer. But beneath the legal codes and court filings was a question no one could answer. Why? They didn't need money. There was no ransom. No attempt to cover their tracks beyond the basics. If anything, Phelps seemed to want someone to find those images, to see what he'd done. And the deeper I dug, the more disturbing it became. Because Phelps wasn't just an isolated monster in the woods. There were signs, online activity, messages, cryptic posts, that he may have been part of something bigger. A community, or at least a subculture. One that trafficked in images, in fantasies, in what they called meat processing. There were whispers of dark web forums, mentions of women, previous attempts. None of it confirmed, but enough to keep me awake at night. The case was becoming too heavy for local authorities alone. Federal agents began coordinating efforts. Everything was being cataloged: blood spatter, hair, tools, floorboards, hard drives. And every new detail only deepened the horror. But it wasn't over. Because just as the legal process kicked into motion, something else happened. Something explosive. The deeper I dug into James Phelps and Timothy Norton, the more unsettling the picture became. These weren't just two violent men who snapped. They were deliberate, patient, almost surgical in the way they approached what they did to Cassidy Rainwater. And they didn't come out of nowhere. James Phelps was 58, a loner, retired, living off-grid in a home that looked more like a bunker than a house. No wife, no kids, no real ties. He'd lived in the Ozarks most of his life, drifting from job to job, collecting disability, keeping to himself. Neighbors described him as strange, but harmless. He wore camouflage even to the grocery store. He never spoke unless spoken to. But his internet activity told a different story. Investigators uncovered encrypted drives full of disturbing content, violent fantasies, detailed survivalist manuals, even crude digital renderings of women in cages. One folder was labeled Projects. Inside were documents with step-by-step outlines: how to build a soundproof room, how to store human tissue, how to avoid detection. That wasn't a fantasy life. That was planning. Timothy Norton, on the other hand, was the muscle. A former Marine turned long-haul trucker with a history of aggression. He was 56, with a record for assault and intimidation. Bigger, louder than Phelps, but in their dynamic, clearly the follower. He'd known Phelps for years, often stopping by the Moon Valley property during his off days. Their relationship was strange. Not quite equals, but not strangers either. One agent described it to me as a bond formed around depravity. They didn't seem to have much else in common. But they shared this, an obsession with control. It wasn't just that they held Cassidy in a cage. It was how they documented it. The phone images, the angles, the lighting, it was almost clinical. As if they were building a portfolio. Treating a real human being like an object in a twisted art project. One recovered note, written in Phelps's handwriting, read simply: "First time went smoother than expected. Must reinforce base of the cage." That line haunted me. First time. Did that mean what I thought it meant? There were no other known victims. But that didn't mean they didn't exist. The land surrounding Phelps's home stretched deep into the woods. Remote. Unsearched. I was told the FBI spent months reviewing missing persons cases across the state, looking for patterns, for any link to Phelps or Norton. Nothing stuck. But the unease remained. Even more disturbing were rumors that surfaced online. Posts on fringe forums claiming to recognize the style of the photos. Talk of underground communities, meat markets, anonymous buyers. No concrete proof, but enough murmur to make me wonder if this case had roots deeper than just two men. Locals didn't know what to think. Some blamed meth. Others whispered about satanic cults. One woman told me her family had hunted in those woods for generations, and now they'd never set foot there again. What stood out to me was the calculated nature of everything. From the tools in the shed to the blood drainage system in the floor, to the fact that the freezer wasn't just there, it had backup power. A generator, buried cables, manual override. They expected this to go on for a while. And then, just as the case was about to move forward, with charges filed, media interest growing, and both men in custody, the house on Moon Valley Road went up in flames. And no one could explain why. On the morning of October 4th, 2021, fire crews were called to a remote blaze just outside Lebanon, Missouri. It was the house on Moon Valley Road, the one that had become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing murder cases in recent memory. By the time responders arrived, it was already too late. The house was fully engulfed. Black smoke curled into the sky. Walls caved. The roof collapsed. Whatever secrets the property still held were going up in flames. At first, everyone thought it was an accident. Maybe faulty wiring. Maybe a gas leak. But then someone noticed the burn pattern. The Missouri State Fire Marshal was brought in to investigate. The findings were immediate and explosive. It was arson. Accelerants had been used in multiple places. The origin point wasn't the kitchen or a utility line. It was inside the living room, near what had once been the area housing the cage. And worse, in the debris, investigators found homemade incendiary devices. Jars, wires, triggers. Someone had deliberately burned that house down, and they'd used explosives to do it. The public didn't hear about that right away. Law enforcement kept it quiet, hoping the evidence might lead somewhere. But nothing stuck. No fingerprints. No security footage. The house was too isolated. No neighbors saw anything. And both Phelps and Norton? They were in jail when it happened. So who burned it down? That question never got answered. Not officially. There were theories, though. Plenty of them. Some believed it was a vigilante. Someone who couldn't stomach the idea of that house still standing after what had happened inside. A symbolic act. Others suspected a third accomplice, maybe someone who'd helped with the setup or knew what was coming. Someone who wanted to erase evidence before the feds found more. The most disturbing theory? That the fire wasn't to destroy evidence, but to send a message. To whom, though? And from whom? I couldn't shake the feeling that the fire wasn't the end of something. It was a transition, like someone closing a chapter before it could be read. What also stood out was how fast the official attention moved on. Once the fire report came back as undetermined suspect, the story vanished from headlines. No arrests. No follow-up. It was treated like a grim footnote. But for me, it was the moment the story changed. Because up until then, everything had a shape, a timeline, a motive, however twisted. But the fire, that was chaos. That was interference. And if someone was willing to risk their life to burn that house down while it was being actively investigated, then maybe there was more we hadn't uncovered. I drove back out there a few weeks later. The land was scorched, a blackened crater where the house had been. The trees around it were singed but still standing. And in the ash, I saw something small, melted plastic and glass. What was left of a surveillance camera that had been mounted near the back door. Not police-issued. Not part of the investigation. This was something else. Someone had been watching the house, even after the arrests. To this day, no one knows who lit the match. But from that moment on, one thing became clear. This story wasn't going to end cleanly. By the time the court dates rolled around, the damage was already done. The headlines had come and gone. The house was gone. The evidence had been cataloged, the horror dissected. But none of it brought Cassidy Rainwater back. And none of it explained why. In April 2023, James Phelps accepted what's called an Alford plea, a legal maneuver where a defendant doesn't admit guilt but acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict. It's not quite a confession, but in a case this brutal, it was enough. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Timothy Norton followed in June 2023. Unlike Phelps, Norton pleaded guilty. Straightforward. No appeals. No games. Another life sentence. No parole. For the state, it was closure. For the media, it was the final line. But for Cassidy's family, and anyone paying close attention, it was an unfinished story. Because even as the courtroom doors closed, so many questions remained open. What exactly motivated these two men? Was it sadism? Power? Something darker rooted in ideology or subculture? No manifesto was ever found. No coherent statement of motive. Just a series of brutal actions and silent stares. And then there was the fire. No suspects. No charges. Just a burnt-out lot and the uneasy sense that someone, somewhere, had pulled off the perfect erasure. The surveillance camera still haunts me. Who installed it? Who watched that feed? Did they see the moment the flames began? There were whispers, of course. Talk of underground markets, encrypted message boards, hints that Cassidy wasn't the only intended victim. But in the absence of hard evidence, those theories remained just that, theories. The truth is, some stories don't end with a revelation. They end with a void. I keep thinking about Cassidy. She wasn't famous. She wasn't powerful. She was just trying to rebuild her life. To get through a rough season. She trusted someone to help her, and it cost her everything. Her final days, locked in that cage, were lived in silence. And maybe that's what haunts me the most. Because the system almost didn't notice. She almost vanished without a trace. If not for those photos, if not for one anonymous tip, she might still be considered just missing. Not murdered. Not mourned. Just gone. I've reported on many crimes. Some senseless. Some monstrous. But this one sits with me differently. Because it wasn't just evil. It was planned, performed, and almost perfectly buried.